The year is 1672, and the Dutch Republic, the wealthiest and most liberal nation in Europe, is in a state of primal fear. It is the Rampjaar, the disaster year. Invaded from all sides by the armies of England, France, and Germany, the country is on the brink of annihilation. The people are screaming for a savior, but first they demand a sacrifice, and they have chosen two victims, the very two brothers who had guided their nation through its golden age. For 2 decades, Johan de Witt had been the Grand Pensionary, the de facto leader of the Dutch Republic. He was not a king, but a brilliant statesman, a man of reason, logic, and republican values. Alongside his brother Cornelis, a respected naval hero, he had presided over an era of unprecedented wealth, artistic flourishing, and global trade. But in the face of invasion, the panicked populace, whipped into a frenzy by their political rivals from the royalist House of Orange, decided that the de Witt's rationalism was weakness. They blamed the brothers for the country's military failures. The people they had served for 20 years now saw them as traitors. The betrayal began with a lie. Cornelis de Witt was arrested on a fabricated charge of plotting to assassinate the new leader of the army, the young William of Orange. He was taken to the Gevangeenpoort, the prison in the heart of the Hague, and subjected to brutal torture on the rack. Despite the agony, he refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. With no confession, the court could only sentence him to exile. On the morning of August 20th, Johan de Witt received a message that his brother was to be released. Worried for Cornelis' safety, Johan went to the prison to escort him home. It was a trap. His arrival was the signal his enemies had been waiting for. Suddenly, the church bells of The Hague began to ring. It was the signal for the local civic militia to assemble. As they gathered, prominent Orangist plotters spread a false rumor that peasants were coming to plunder the city. The militia, the only force that could have protected the de Witts, was conveniently sent away to defend the city gates from a non-existent threat. At the same time, Orangist preachers delivered fiery sermons, stirring up the crowds, telling them that the de Witt brothers were traitors who were about to escape justice. A massive, enraged mob, thousands strong, descended upon the prison. They were armed with axes, knives, and blacksmith's hammers. The few guards remaining at the Gevangeenpoort were quickly overwhelmed. The mob smashed down the doors and swarmed into the prison, their rage echoing through the stone corridors. They found the two brothers in Cornelis' cell. They were waiting calmly, reading the Bible. They knew their end had come. The mob dragged them from the cell. Cornelis was the first to fall, struck down on the staircase with a pike. Johan was dragged outside, trying to shield his face. A gunshot to the head ended his life. But for the mob, death was not enough. Their betrayal had to be absolute. What followed was one of the most gruesome spectacles in European history. The bodies of the two brothers were dragged to the public gallows. They were stripped naked, mutilated, and hung upside down by their feet, a display of ultimate humiliation. But even this was not the end. The fury of the crowd descended into a cannibalistic frenzy. Members of the mob began to act like a pack of wolves, tearing at the corpses. They cut off the brothers' fingers, toes, and other body parts to keep as gruesome souvenirs. Then came the final, unthinkable act. Historical accounts, including the diary of a man who was there, describe how pieces of the brothers' bodies, their livers, their hearts, were cut out, roasted over a nearby fire, and eaten by members of the frenzied crowd. This was no longer a political assassination. This was a complete and total desecration, a ritualistic destruction of the men who had once been the revered leaders of their nation. They had been utterly consumed by the very people they had dedicated their lives to serving. The murder of the de Witt brothers was a brutal political backstab, masterfully disguised as spontaneous popular rage. The new leader, William of Orange, did nothing to stop the lynching and later protected the ringleaders from punishment, effectively rewarding the murderers of his political rivals. The event sent a shockwave of horror across Europe. It was a terrifying demonstration of how quickly the veneer of civilization can be stripped away, leaving only primal savagery. The story of Johan and Cornelis de Witt stands as one of history's most extreme examples of betrayal, a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes the person you trust most is not a friend or a family member, but the people you lead, and their gratitude can turn to cannibalistic fury in the blink of an eye. The four knights, their swords drawn and their faces grim, stormed through the hallowed halls of Canterbury Cathedral. It was December 29, 1170. Vespers had just begun, and the terrified monks, hearing the armored men approaching, rushed to bar the heavy doors to the main sanctuary. But their archbishop, a tall, imposing man named Thomas Becket, stopped them. "Far be it from us to make a fortress of the house of God," he commanded. He knew who these men were, and he knew who had, in essence, sent them. He was ready to meet his fate. To understand this act of martyrdom, you must first understand the great friendship that preceded it. For years, King Henry II of England and Thomas Becket were inseparable. Henry was a powerful, energetic, and often ruthless king, determined to consolidate his power over England. In Thomas Becket, a brilliant and charismatic Londoner, he found the perfect tool and his closest companion. Henry made Becket his chancellor, the highest office in the kingdom. Together, they were a formidable duo. They worked side by side. They laughed, they hunted, they drank, and they plotted to bring the unruly English barons to heel. Becket was not some pious churchman. He was a man of the world, living a life of incredible luxury and flamboyant style, often outshining the king himself. He was Henry's enforcer, his confidant, and perhaps his only true friend. The trust between them was absolute. But King Henry had a problem. One institution in his kingdom remained stubbornly outside of his royal control: the church. In the 12th century, the church was a state within a state, with its own courts, its own laws, and its own allegiance to the Pope in Rome. Clergymen who committed crimes like theft or even murder could escape the king's justice by claiming trial in a church court, where punishments were laughably lenient. For a control freak like Henry, this was intolerable. In 1162, the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and Henry saw a golden opportunity. He came up with what he thought was a brilliant solution. He would appoint his best friend, his loyal worldly chancellor, Thomas Becket, as the new head of the church in England. He believed Becket would remain his man, a puppet who would wear the archbishop's robes but serve the king's will. He trusted his friend to help him bring the church to heel. This was the calculation that would destroy their friendship and change the course of English history. It was the lie upon which everything was built. The moment Thomas Becket was consecrated as archbishop, a shocking transformation occurred. The man of luxury and politics vanished. Becket took his new holy orders with a terrifying seriousness that no one, least of all the king, had anticipated. He resigned as chancellor, betraying Henry's expectation that he would hold both offices. He traded his fine silk robes for a coarse hair shirt worn secretly beneath his vestments, a garment so infested with lice that it reportedly crawled. He became a fierce, unyielding, and dogmatic defender of the church's liberties, directly opposing the king at every turn. The king's greatest ally had become his most formidable and infuriating adversary. What followed was a bitter, years-long Cold War between the two former friends. They clashed in public over the rights of the church courts. Henry issued decrees to assert his power. Becket responded by excommunicating the king's supporters. The conflict became so intense that Becket was forced to flee into exile in France for 6 years. It was a heartbreaking political divorce, a battle of wills between two proud and stubborn men who refused to back down. Finally, in 1170, a fragile peace was brokered, and Becket returned to England. But he immediately reignited the conflict by excommunicating the bishops who had sided with the king during his exile. When news of this latest act of defiance reached Henry at his court in Normandy, the king flew into one of his famous uncontrollable rages. He collapsed in a chair, ranting and raving about the man he had raised from nothing who now treated him with such contempt. In the heat of his fury, he famously roared, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" It was not a direct order, it was an explosion of royal frustration. But for 4 of the knights in his court, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton. The king's words were a clear command. They saw an opportunity to win their lord's favor. They secretly sailed to England, determined to rid their king of this turbulent priest. They found him in his cathedral. They confronted him near a pillar, demanding he absolve the bishops. Becket refused. As they drew their swords, he stood his ground. He was a knight of God now, and he would not flee his house. The first blow sliced his shoulder. The second struck his head, bringing him to his knees. A third blow shattered his skull, and a fourth knight's sword struck with such force that its tip broke off on the stone floor. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, lay dead at the foot of his own altar, his blood and brains sanctifying the cathedral floor. The murder sent a shockwave of horror throughout Christendom. The sacrilege of killing an archbishop inside his own cathedral was unthinkable. Becket was almost immediately hailed as a martyr, and miracles were reported at his tomb. The Pope canonized him as a saint just 3 years later, and Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the world. For King Henry, the backstab was complete, but the victory was hollow. He was consumed by public outrage and his own private grief and remorse. To atone for his sin, he performed a dramatic public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by 80 monks at St. Thomas's tomb. The friend he had raised to power had, in death, become a saint far more powerful than Henry could ever hope to be. The king's angry words had murdered his friend, but in doing so, had created a legend that would forever eclipse his own. In the final, desperate years of the Russian Empire, as the nation was being torn apart by the First World War, the imperial court at St. Petersburg was haunted by a ghost. He was not a ghost of the dead, but a living phantom of peasant superstition, a man with hypnotic, burning eyes, a matted beard, and the uncanny ability to wrap the royal family around his finger. His name was Grigory Rasputin, a wandering Siberian faith healer who came to be known as the Mad Monk. To the Empress of all Russia, Alexandra Feodorovna, he was a holy man, a prophet sent by God. To nearly everyone else, he was the cancer that was rotting the monarchy from the inside out. The source of Rasputin's incredible power was a single, desperate secret: the health of the heir to the throne, the young Tsarevich Alexei. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disease that prevented his blood from clotting. The slightest bump or scrape could lead to days of agonizing pain and life-threatening internal bleeding. The finest doctors in the empire were helpless. But Rasputin, the semi-literate peasant, seemed to possess a miraculous power. On several occasions, when Alexei was near death from a bleeding episode, Rasputin was summoned. Through his calm, commanding presence and fervent prayers, a technique that modern historians believe may have been a form of hypnosis that calmed the boy and lowered his blood pressure, the bleeding would stop. For the frantic Empress Alexandra, this was divine intervention. She came to believe, with every fiber of her being, that Rasputin was the only person who could keep her beloved son alive. This belief gave him her absolute, unshakable trust. He was untouchable, her holy man, her confidant. This trust was the foundation of his power. It was also a lie that would bring an empire to its knees. While the Empress saw a saint, the rest of Russia saw a lecherous, drunken manipulator. Rasputin used his sacred position to indulge his most profane appetites. He held wild, drunken parties, boasted of his sexual conquests with the high-born ladies of St. Petersburg, and was widely rumored to be the Empress's lover. When Tsar Nicholas II went to the front lines to command the army during World War I, he left his wife, Alexandra, in charge of the government. This meant that Rasputin, the man she trusted implicitly, became the shadow ruler of Russia. Government ministers were appointed and dismissed based on his whims. His corrupt and incompetent cronies were placed in positions of immense power. The entire empire was being steered by the nonsensical ramblings of a debauched Siberian peasant. For a group of powerful Russian aristocrats, this was too much to bear. They saw Rasputin not just as an embarrassment, but as a German spy who was deliberately destroying Russia from within. They decided that to save the monarchy, the Mad Monk had to die. The betrayal had to come from within Rasputin's own circle. The leader of the conspiracy was Prince Felix Yusupov, an immensely wealthy and flamboyant young noble who was married to the Tsar's own niece. Yusupov spent months befriending Rasputin, gaining his trust and inviting him to his lavish parties, all while secretly plotting his murder. On the night of December 30th, 1916, Yusupov sprung his trap. He invited Rasputin to his magnificent Moika palace, using an irresistible lure, the promise that Rasputin would finally get to meet Yusupov's famously beautiful wife, Irina. Rasputin was led down to a lavishly decorated cellar where a table was set. Yusupov offered his guest pastries and his favorite sweet Madeira wine. What Rasputin didn't know was that the cakes and wine had been laced with enough powdered cyanide to kill a half-dozen men. The prince watched in a cold sweat as Rasputin devoured several of the poison cakes and drank 2 glasses of the wine. He waited for the man to collapse, but nothing happened. Rasputin continued to chat, seemingly unaffected. Panicked, Yusupov excused himself and upstairs to his co-conspirators and grabbed a revolver. He returned to the cellar and, while Rasputin was admiring a crucifix, shot him in the chest. Rasputin let out a roar and collapsed to the floor. Believing him dead, the conspirators began to celebrate. But when Yusupov went to check the body, the horror began. According to his own memoirs, Rasputin's eyes suddenly flew open. With a demonic snarl, the dead man leaped to his feet, grabbed Yusupov by the throat, and whispered his name. He then stumbled, bleeding and roaring up the stairs and out into the snowy palace courtyard. The other conspirators rushed after him, firing their guns. He was shot 2 more times in the back, and a final, point-blank shot to the forehead brought him down for good. Not taking any more chances, they brutally bludgeoned his body with a steel club, bound it with rope, and threw it through a hole in the ice of the frozen Neva River. When Rasputin's body was recovered a few days later, the autopsy revealed that despite the poison and the bullets, his lungs were full of water. He had still been alive and struggling when he was thrown into the river. The nobles' backstab, an act they believed would save Russia and restore dignity to the throne, did the exact opposite. It shattered the empress, delegitimized the monarchy in the eyes of the people, and became a lurid symbol of the regime's deep-seated rot. Just a few short months after the Mad Monk's murder, the Russian Revolution began, and the Romanov dynasty was swept away forever. The plot to kill Rasputin was a failure in every sense. The man they trusted had betrayed them, and in turn, their betrayal of him only guaranteed their own destruction. In 1532, the Inca Empire was the largest and richest in the Americas, a sprawling realm stretching for thousands of miles along the Andes Mountains. Its people were sophisticated, its cities magnificent, and its wealth in gold and silver legendary. But this golden age was about to come to a brutal and sudden end with the arrival of a small band of Spanish conquistadors led by the ruthless and cunning Francisco Pizarro. What followed was not just a conquest, but a masterclass in deception, and a betrayal so profound it shattered an empire. The Inca had been weakened by a recent civil war between 2 half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, vying for the throne. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, and it was to him, the newly crowned emperor, that Pizarro sent messengers proclaiming his arrival as an envoy of a powerful king from across the sea. Intrigued and perhaps underestimating the threat posed by such a small force, Atahualpa agreed to meet the Spanish in the city of Cajamarca. It was a fateful decision, built on a foundation of cultural misunderstanding and a fatal trust in the Spaniards' word. When Atahualpa arrived at the appointed time, he did so with all the pomp and ceremony befitting the son of the sun. Thousands of unarmed attendants accompanied him, a clear indication that he expected a peaceful exchange. The Spanish, however, had other plans. Pizarro had concealed his men, including his cannons and cavalry, in the buildings surrounding the city's main square. It was an ambush waiting to be sprung. As Atahualpa entered the square, a Dominican friar stepped forward and presented him with a Bible, demanding that he acknowledge the supremacy of the Christian God and the King of Spain. Atahualpa, unfamiliar with the book and the concepts being presented to him, reportedly examined it with curiosity before tossing it to the ground. This act, whether a sign of ignorance or defiance, was the prearranged signal. With a deafening roar, Pizarro unleashed his forces. Cannons fired, scattering the terrified Inca. Armored cavalry charged into the unarmed crowd, hacking and trampling. The surprise was complete, the slaughter immense. Thousands of Inca were cut down in the blink of an eye. Pizarro's target was Atahualpa himself, carried on a lavish litter. The Spanish fought their way towards him, their steel swords no match for the emperor's golden ornaments and the soft flesh of his bearers. In the chaos, Pizarro personally seized Atahualpa, dragging him from his litter. The slaughter continued for hours, a massacre of the unsuspecting. By the end of the day, an estimated 7,000 Inca lay dead in the square of Cajamarca. The emperor of the Inca Empire was now a prisoner of a few hundred foreign adventurers. The trust Atahualpa had placed in Pizarro's promises of a peaceful meeting had been brutally betrayed. Everything had been a lie. Now a captive, Atahualpa quickly realized that the Spaniards' primary motivation was not religion or diplomacy, but an insatiable hunger for gold. Desperate to regain his freedom and save his empire from further destruction, Atahualpa made Pizarro an extraordinary offer. In exchange for his release, he would fill a large room with gold as high as he could reach, and then fill 2 more similar rooms with silver. It was a ransom beyond the dreams of avarice, the wealth of an empire laid bare. Pizarro, despite his initial shock at the scale of the offer, readily agreed. He kept Atahualpa imprisoned, while messengers were dispatched throughout the Inca Empire, ordering the people to send their gold and silver to Cajamarca. For months, a steady stream of unimaginable riches flowed into the Spanish camp. Golden statues, intricate ornaments, and vast quantities of silver were melted down into ingots. The ransom was being paid in full, but even as the ransom piled up, Pizarro had no intention of honoring his word. He saw Atahualpa not as a king to be negotiated with, but as a valuable hostage to control the Inca people. Rumors began to spread among the Spanish that Atahualpa was secretly planning an uprising. Whether these rumors were true or deliberately fabricated by Pizarro to justify his treachery remains a matter of debate. Regardless, Pizarro seized the opportunity. He staged a mock trial for the Inca emperor. The charges were absurd: inciting rebellion, idolatry, and the murder of his half-brother Huascar, an act Pizarro himself had arguably benefited from. Atahualpa was found guilty. His fate was sealed. In a final act of manipulation, Pizarro offered Atahualpa a choice. He could be burned at the stake, as befitted a heretic, or he could convert to Christianity and be granted the mercy of being strangled to death instead. Facing certain death, Atahualpa agreed to be baptized, taking the name Juan. On August 29, 1533, the last free emperor of the Inca was executed by strangulation in the square of Cajamarca. Pizarro's betrayal of Atahualpa was a pivotal moment in the conquest of the Americas. The Inca emperor, who had trusted in the word of a foreign envoy, was met with deceit, ambush, and ultimately a cold-blooded execution for no crime other than defending his own empire. The vast ransom, the fulfillment of Atahualpa's desperate plea for freedom, only fueled the Spanish greed and sealed his doom. The murder of Atahualpa plunged the Inca Empire into chaos, paving the way for the complete and brutal Spanish domination of the region. The riches that flowed from this ultimate betrayal would forever alter the course of history, built upon a foundation of broken trust and the blood of a deceived emperor. By the year 44 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was more than a man. He was a living god. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and defeated his great rival Pompey in a bloody civil war. He was the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, eager to flatter its new master, had showered him with unprecedented honors. They named him Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, and Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. His face was stamped on the coinage, his statues were placed in the temples, and a month of the year was renamed in his honor, July. To the common people of Rome, he was a hero who had brought stability after years of chaos. But to a small circle of senators, many of whom he considered his friends, he was a tyrant who was strangling the Roman Republic, and they believed the only cure for tyranny was the cold steel of a dagger. The foundation of this great betrayal was built upon Caesar's most famous virtue, his clementia, or mercy. Throughout the Civil War, he had made a public spectacle of pardoning his defeated enemies. He believed this act of grace would earn their loyalty and heal the wounds of the Republic. Many of the men who would eventually plunge their daggers into his body were former opponents whom he had not only forgiven but promoted to high office, trusting them to help him rebuild Rome. This trust, this belief in his own magnanimity, would be his fatal error. Nowhere was this trust more profound than in his relationship with Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus had fought against Caesar in the Civil War, but after the defeat of his faction, Caesar had personally ordered his men not to harm him. He had pardoned Brutus completely, made him governor of a rich province, and elevated him to one of the highest positions in the state. Caesar's affection for Brutus was well known. It was fueled by his lifelong love for Brutus's mother, Servilia, with whom Caesar had a long and passionate affair. It was widely rumored in Rome that Caesar may have even believed Brutus was his own illegitimate son. He treated him like family. But Brutus was also the descendant of another more ancient figure, Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder who had driven out Rome's last king 5 centuries earlier. To men like Brutus and his co-conspirator, the sharp-minded Gaius Cassius Longinus, Caesar's actions looked dangerously like those of a king. His lifetime dictatorship, his golden throne in the Senate, the talk of him being declared a god, these were all anathema to the spirit of the Republic. They convinced themselves that they were not murdering a friend, but assassinating a tyrant. They were betraying one man to save the soul of Rome. Everything, they told themselves, was a lie. The conspiracy grew to include over 60 senators. They chose to strike on the Ides of March 15th, during a meeting of the Senate. The omens, it was said, were terrible. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had a nightmare of holding his murdered body and begged him not to go. He received a warning from a soothsayer to beware the Ides of March. Hesitating, Caesar initially decided to stay home, but the conspirators could not be delayed. One of their number, a man named Decimus Brutus, another of Caesar's trusted friends, was dispatched to his house. Decimus mocked the superstitions and persuaded Caesar that his absence would be seen as an insult to the Senate. He personally escorted his friend into the trap. As Caesar took his seat at the theater of Pompey, the conspirators crowded around him, pretending to support a petition. The signal was given. One senator grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it from his neck. Another, Casca, lunged forward with a dagger, striking him in the shoulder. Caesar, a seasoned warrior, fought back, stabbing Casca in the arm with his writing stylus. But then he was surrounded. Daggers flashed from every direction. He was stabbed again and again, a flurry of 23 wounds. He tried to fight, but he was cornered and overwhelmed. Then, through the chaos and the blood, he saw him. Marcus Junius Brutus, his protege, his friend, the man he treated like a son, lunging forward with his own dagger drawn. It was at this moment, according to the historian Suetonius, that Caesar gave up the fight. He looked at Brutus and uttered his final words, not in Latin, but in the intimate Greek of their private conversations. "You too, my child?" With that final gasp of betrayal, he pulled his toga over his head, refusing to let his assassins see his face in the moment of death, and collapsed at the foot of the statue of his great rival, Pompey. The conspirators, calling themselves the Liberators, rushed from the building, their daggers still dripping with blood, shouting that they had freed Rome from tyranny. They expected the people to erupt in cheers. Instead, they were met with stunned, horrified silence, which soon turned to outrage. Their great backstab did not save the Republic, it condemned it. Caesar's murder ignited another 13 years of brutal civil war. This new conflict ended with the complete destruction of the conspirators and the rise of Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, who would take the name Augustus and become Rome's first true emperor. The ultimate irony of this most famous betrayal is that the men who murdered Caesar to prevent one man from ruling as king were directly responsible for creating the line of emperors who would rule Rome for the next 500 years. The year is 336 BC, and the city of Eg, the ancient capital of Macedon, is consumed by celebration. King Philip II is at the absolute zenith of his power. He is no longer the ruler of a backwater kingdom of shepherds. He is the undisputed master of all of Greece. Through decades of brilliant diplomacy, political maneuvering, and relentless warfare, he had transformed his nation. He had created the professional Macedonian army, revolutionized warfare with the sarissa-wielding phalanx, and had, one by one, brought the proud Greek city-states like Athens and Thebes to heel. Now he was celebrating the wedding of his daughter, a grand event meant to showcase his power before he embarked on his life's ultimate ambition, a massive invasion to conquer the mighty Persian Empire. But in this moment of ultimate triumph, a shadow was lurking in his own inner circle, ready to strike. The betrayal would come from one of the men he trusted with his life, every single day. The assassin was a man named Pausanias of Orestes. He was not a disgruntled noble or a foreign agent. He was a member of Philip's most elite unit, one of his 7 personal bodyguards, the Samada Felix. This was a position of immense honor, granted only to those with proven loyalty and valor. Pausanias stood by the king's side, a human shield tasked with protecting him from all threats. No one could have been closer, no one could have been more trusted. The official motive for the backstab, as recorded by ancient historians, was a deeply personal grievance. Pausanias, it was said, had been the victim of a horrific gang rape. The assault was orchestrated by a powerful general named Attalus, who happened to be the uncle of Philip's new young wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. When the humiliated Pausanias went to his king, demanding justice, Philip was in a difficult political position. Attalus was a key commander in his upcoming invasion of Persia, and now a member of his new extended family. Punishing him would be inconvenient. So, instead of justice, Philip offered Pausanias a promotion within the royal guard. He tried to buy his silence with honor. For Pausanias, this was the ultimate insult. The king had not only allowed his attacker to go unpunished, but had tried to placate him with a title. His pain was ignored for political expediency. His loyalty was repaid with indifference. In that moment, Pausanias' rage shifted from his attacker to the king who had failed him. His quest for revenge would now target the throne itself. The moment came during the grand procession into the city's theater. In a gesture of arrogance and confidence, Philip ordered his own bodyguards to hang back, entering the theater alone to show his people that he did not fear them. This created a brief, fatal window of vulnerability. Pausanias, who had been waiting for just such a moment, rushed forward from the crowd. He pulled out a short Celtic dagger he had hidden in his robes and plunged it deep into the king's chest. Philip II, the hegemon of Greece, collapsed and died almost instantly. Pausanias turned and fled towards getaway horses that had been staged for him outside the city walls. But he was pursued, and in his haste, he tripped on a vine and was killed by the other guards before he could be interrogated. The assassin was dead, but the questions were just beginning. Was this truly just a personal revenge killing? Or was the aggrieved bodyguard simply a pawn, a perfect disposable weapon in a much larger conspiracy? Everything, it seemed, was a lie. Suspicion immediately fell on Philip's first wife, the fiery and formidable Olympias. Philip had recently cast her aside to marry the younger Cleopatra Eurydice, who could provide him with a pure-blooded Macedonian heir, implicitly questioning the legitimacy of his son with Olympias Alexander. Olympias was a proud woman who now faced being replaced. Did she manipulate the angry Pausanias, promising him rewards to eliminate her husband and ensure her own son would take the throne? Her actions after the murder were certainly suspicious. It was said she returned to the city, placed a golden crown upon Pausanias' crucified corpse, and later held a funeral for him alongside her husband. And then there was the most shocking suspect of all, her son Alexander, soon to be known as Alexander the Great. His relationship with his father was fraught with tension. At the wedding feast for Philip's new wife, the general Attalus had drunkenly made a toast, praying for a legitimate heir to the throne. An enraged Alexander had thrown his wine cup, screaming, "Am I then a bastard?" Philip, drunk himself, drew his sword and lunged at his son, only to trip and fall in a stupor. Alexander had famously mocked him. Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another without falling. Alexander had been briefly exiled after the incident. Was he complicit in his own father's murder to secure his inheritance before a new half-brother could be born? The truth of who was truly behind the assassination of Philip II died with Pausanias. We will never know if he acted alone out of a thirst for personal revenge, or if he was an instrument of a spurned wife, an ambitious son, or even the Persian Empire, desperate to stop a coming invasion. But the result is undeniable. The backstab in Hague did more than just kill a king. It was the starting pistol for the career of the greatest conqueror in the ancient world. The betrayal, born from a web of secrets and lies, removed the one man standing in Alexander's way and unleashed his military genius upon the world. It was a single bloody moment that ended one great legacy and ignited another. He was only 17 years old when he was dragged from the splendor of the Topkapi Palace. He was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, a ruler whose ancestors had conquered Constantinople and terrified Christendom. But on that fateful day in May of 1622, he was just a boy, thrown onto a common mangy workhorse. He was paraded through the streets of his own capital, Istanbul, where he was subjected to the jeers, insults, and abuse of the very soldiers who were sworn to die for him. His crime was not tyranny or incompetence. His crime was that he dared to try and change a system that had grown too powerful to be controlled. This was Sultan Osman II. Unlike many of the sultans who came before him, he was no decadent prisoner of the harem. He was young, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. A gifted poet and a speaker of multiple languages, including Latin, he was determined to restore the glory of his empire. In 1621, he personally led the massive Ottoman army on a campaign against Poland. It was on this campaign, in the mud and cold of the battlefield, that he came to a stark and dangerous realization: the heart of his army was rotten. The foundation of Ottoman military might for centuries had been the Janissary Corps. They were a unique and formidable institution, recruited as young boys from Christian families in the Balkans through a process called the Devshirm, or Child Levi. They were forcibly converted to Islam and raised in Spartan barracks with an absolute, fanatical loyalty to the Sultan's person. They were in essence the Sultan's slave soldiers. For centuries, this had made them the most disciplined and feared infantry force in the world. But by Osman's time, they had become corrupt, arrogant, and deeply conservative. They had grown rich, married, and engaged in business. They were now a powerful political class, a state within a state, more interested in protecting their immense privileges than in fighting for the empire. During the Polish campaign, Osman was disgusted by their lack of discipline and their unwillingness to fight. He blamed them directly for the army's failure to achieve a decisive victory. Returning to Istanbul, the young sultan made a secret, radical decision. He would abolish the Janissaries entirely. The institution that had been the bedrock of Ottoman power was, in his eyes, now a cancer. His plan was to create a new, modern, and loyal army, recruited from the native Turkish-speaking peoples of Anatolia and the Middle East. He began secretly recruiting for this new force under the clever guise of announcing he was undertaking the Hajj, the great pilgrimage to Mecca, and needed a new guard to accompany him. Everything, he told his inner circle, was a lie. But in the paranoid, rumor-filled streets of Istanbul, secrets were impossible to keep. The Janissaries heard whispers of the Sultan's plan. They learned of the new army being recruited in Asia. They saw the Sultan's actions not as a necessary reform, but as a direct threat to their lives, their wealth, and their very existence. The betrayal from their perspective was coming from their own master, so they chose to betray him first. In May of 1622, the Janissaries rose in revolt. They stormed through the city, executing high officials loyal to Osman. They demanded that the Sultan hand over his reformist advisors. Osman, hoping to appease the mob, made a fatal error. He gave up his Grand Vizier and another official, who were immediately torn to pieces. But appeasement only emboldened them. The mob's rage was now directed at the Sultan himself. They stormed the Topkapi Palace, and with the support of the Sultan's own mother, they deposed Osman. They dragged his mentally unstable uncle, Mustafa I, from the palace dungeons where he had been confined for years and declared him the new sultan. The system was protecting itself. Osman's humiliation was just beginning. He was subjected to the ritual degradation of a deposed tyrant. He was stripped of his finery, placed on a common nag, and led through the city to the Janissary barracks, where he was taunted and abused. The sacred aura of the Sultanate was shattered. Later, he was transferred to the notorious Yetikule Fortress, the Fortress of the Seven Towers, a grim prison used for high-profile political prisoners. The new Grand Vizier, a man named Kara Davud Pasha, knew that as long as Osman was alive, he remained a threat. He rode to the fortress and ordered the young sultan's execution. When the executioners entered his cell, the 17-year-old Osman did not go quietly. A skilled warrior, he fought back with the ferocity of a cornered lion, desperate for his life. Accounts say he managed to knock down one of his attackers and fought so hard that the executioners, a group of powerful men struggled to subdue him. He was finally overpowered, and in the dark, cold cell, the once mighty sultan was strangled to death with a bowstring. In a final, gruesome act to prove the deed was done, one of his ears was allegedly cut off and presented to the new sultan's mother. The murder of Sultan Osman II was a brutal and shocking backstab that sent tremors through the Ottoman Empire. He was a capable and forward-thinking ruler who correctly identified a deep rot within his state. But he was young, impatient, and he fatally underestimated the ferocity with which a powerful and corrupt system will fight to preserve itself. The very slave soldiers who were created to be the Sultan's unthinking tools had betrayed and murdered their master for daring to challenge their power. This event solidified the Janissaries' corrupt influence over the throne for another century, ushering in an era of instability and weak rulers. Osman's story is a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous betrayal comes not from a single friend, but from the very foundations of power you inherit. The screams that echoed from the dungeons of Berkeley Castle in September of 1327 were said to be so horrifying that they could be heard for miles around. Local villagers stopped in the streets, crossing themselves and praying for the soul of the man being so inhumanly tormented within. That man was Edward II, the recently deposed King of England. He had been betrayed by his barons, abandoned by his people, and finally overthrown by the one person who was supposed to be his most loyal partner, his own wife, the Queen of England. Edward II's tragedy was that he was the son of a lion. His father was the formidable King Edward I, Longshanks, a towering, battle-hardened warrior who had conquered Wales and fought the Scots. The expectations for his son were immense, but Edward II was not a warrior. He was a man who preferred music, boating, and rural crafts to the brutal arts of war and statecraft. This in itself was a disappointment to the warlike English nobility, but his greatest transgression in their eyes was his tendency to form intense, all-consuming, and almost certainly romantic relationships with male favorites, upon whom he would shower titles, wealth, and power. The first and most infamous of these was a charismatic Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Edward's obsession with Gaveston was a public scandal. He elevated his favorite far above the established English barons, granting him the dukedom of Cornwall, a title previously reserved for royalty. The king ignored his royal duties, and he ignored his young wife, Isabella of France, to spend his time with Gaveston. The barons, led by the powerful Earl of Lancaster, were enraged. They saw Gaveston as an arrogant, foreign upstart who had bewitched the king and was bankrupting the kingdom. For years, the politics of England revolved around this toxic conflict, with the barons repeatedly forcing Edward to exile Gaveston, only for the lovesick king to recall him. The backstab came in 1312, when a group of barons captured Gaveston and, ignoring the king's pleas, had him unceremoniously executed. Edward was heartbroken, and he never forgave them. His grief, however, did not last forever. Soon a new favorite emerged, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was even more greedy, ambitious, and hated by the nobility than Gaveston had been. He and his father manipulated the king to enrich themselves, seizing lands and consolidating power. For Edward's wife, Queen Isabella, this was the final humiliation. She was the daughter of the powerful King of France, known as Isabella the Fair. But in her own court, she was a political nobody, cast aside by her husband for another male favorite. The trust between husband and wife was shattered. Everything had been a lie, a political marriage in which she was just a prop. So, she began to plot her revenge. Her opportunity came in 1325, when Edward sent her to her native France on a diplomatic mission to resolve a dispute with her brother, the French king. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Once on the continent and away from her husband's control, Isabella refused to return. She issued a public declaration that she would not set foot in England again until the hated Hugh Despenser was removed from the king's side. In Paris, she found a powerful new ally, Roger Mortimer, an influential English baron who had been imprisoned by Edward but had managed a daring escape from the Tower of London. Isabella and Mortimer soon became lovers. Together, they became the center of a growing conspiracy of exiled English nobles, all united by their hatred for Edward and the Despensers. The Queen of England was now openly living with her lover and plotting to overthrow her husband. She gathered a small mercenary army, secured loans, and in September 1326, the She-Wolf of France, as she was now known, launched an invasion of her own kingdom. The backstab was devastatingly effective. Edward's regime crumbled almost instantly. The powerful barons he had alienated for decades refused to come to his aid. The people of England, tired of his misrule and the greed of his favorites, flocked to Isabella's banner. Edward and Despenser were forced to flee, but were soon captured. Hugh Despenser was subjected to a particularly gruesome public execution. He was hanged, drawn and quartered, his genitals cut off and burned before his eyes, because he was deemed a heretic and a sodomite. For Edward, a different fate was reserved. He was imprisoned and, in January 1327, forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. The real power now rested with the Dowager Queen and her lover, Roger Mortimer. But a living, deposed king, even in a dungeon, is always a threat. A potential rallying point for loyalists, Isabella and Mortimer knew he had to be eliminated. Edward was moved to the dungeons of Berkeley Castle, and according to popular legend, a plot was hatched to murder him in a way that would leave no obvious marks of violence on his body. The story that has been passed down for centuries, while likely a gruesome fabrication created later as political propaganda, is one of the most infamous in royal history. It alleges that on the night of September 21st, 1327, assassins entered the king's cell, held him down, and inserted a red-hot poker deep into his bowels through a hollowed-out animal horn. This method, it was said, was a symbolic and horrific punishment for his alleged homosexuality, burning him from the inside out while leaving his body outwardly pristine. While modern historians believe he was more likely suffocated, the power of this legend speaks to the sheer hatred his enemies felt for him. King Edward II's reign was a catastrophic failure, a lesson in how a ruler's personal obsessions can lead to national instability and personal ruin. He was a king who trusted the wrong people, elevated his favorites above his duties, and fatally underestimated the wife he had publicly shamed. The betrayal by Isabella and Mortimer was total. They stole his kingdom, his son, and finally his life. Their story became a dark and cautionary tale, a brutal reminder that in the deadly Game of Thrones, the most intimate backstab often comes not from a friend, but from the person sleeping in the bed beside you. He was the master of Peru, an illiterate swineherd from a poor Spanish village who had crossed the world, toppled one of its great empires, and now governed a vast new territory richer than any in Europe. From his magnificent new palace in Lima, the city of kings which he had founded, the Marquis Francisco Pizarro had everything he had ever dreamed of: unimaginable wealth, titles, and power. But his new empire was built on a foundation of betrayal, and the ghosts of his own backstabs were coming for him, and they wore the face of his former partner's son. The conquest of the Inca had been a joint venture, a pact between two aging, ruthless, and ambitious conquistadors. There was Pizarro, the tough and determined leader, and there was his partner, Diego de Almagro. For years they had been allies, failing together on miserable expeditions, starving together in the jungle, and finally, succeeding together in their audacious plan to capture the Inca Emperor Atahualpa and plunder his empire. They were bound by a legal contract and a shared insatiable lust for gold. They trusted each other to be partners in what would become one of the greatest heists in history. But the moment the gold was in their hands, the partnership began to crumble. The lie at the heart of their agreement was exposed. Pizarro had never seen Almagro as an equal. When the Spanish king divided the new territory, Pizarro, who had better connections at court, made sure he received the far richer and more prestigious northern half, including the valuable Inca capital of Cusco. Almagro was granted the less promising southern lands. The division of spoils was a declaration of war. The conflict between the two former partners and their followers, the Pizarristas and the Almagristas, soon erupted into open civil war. The very Spaniards who had just conquered an empire now turned their swords on each other, fighting over the scraps. The conflict reached its climax in 1538 at the Battle of Los Salinas. Pizarro's forces were victorious, and Diego de Almagro was captured. Pizarro now had his old partner at his mercy. He could have shown clemency, exiling the old man. Instead, he chose the ultimate betrayal. He had the elderly and infirm Almagro put through a sham trial, and publicly executed by strangulation in the main square of Cusco. He had eliminated his rival. He believed the matter was settled, but vengeance has a long memory. The followers of Almagro, and especially his young mixed-race son, also named Diego, were stripped of their lands and fortunes by the victorious Pizarristas. They became known as the Men of the Cape because they were reportedly so poor that a dozen of them had to share a single good cloak to make respectable appearances in the city. Every day they would see Pizarro living in opulence in his palace, and every day their hatred and desire for revenge grew. Pizarro, now in his late 60s and drunk on his own power, was warned repeatedly that the Men of the Cape were plotting against him. He arrogantly dismissed the warnings. "Poor devils," he reportedly said. "They have had a hard enough time. We shall not worry them further." He trusted in his own invincibility, just as Atahualpa had once trusted in his. On Sunday, June 26, 1541, the ghost of his betrayal came to collect its debt. A group of about 20 assassins, led by Almagro's son, El Mozo, stormed out of their shared house during the midday meal, shouting, "Long live the king! Death to the tyrant!" They ran through the city streets to Pizarro's palace. The governor's guards were overwhelmed. The assassins burst into the palace and made their way to the dining hall. Pizarro, though old, was no easy target. He was a veteran of countless battles. Hearing the commotion, he did not flee. He called for his sword, and, with his half-brother and a few loyal pages, prepared to make a final stand. A brutal sword fight erupted in the palace chambers. The aged conqueror fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, cutting down several of his attackers. But they were too many. His companions fell, and he was finally overwhelmed. He was stabbed multiple times, with a final, decisive thrust to his throat. As he collapsed to the floor, bleeding out, the deeply religious Pizarro performed one last act. He traced a cross on the ground with his own blood, and according to legend, cried out, "Jesus," as he tried to kiss it. The man who had betrayed an emperor for gold was, in turn, murdered as a result of a feud with his partner over that same gold. The cycle of greed and violence that he had so brutally unleashed upon the people of Peru had finally turned inward and consumed him. The backstab against Pizarro did not bring peace. It only triggered another bloody chapter in the civil wars among the conquistadors, as El Mozo briefly seized power before being defeated and executed himself. Pizarro's story is a brutal lesson that a partnership founded on violence and theft has no true foundation of trust, and the loyalty of thieves lasts only as long as the treasure they have yet to divide. He was a man of dazzling contradictions. A former Franciscan friar who became a brilliant physicist and professor. A member of secretive Enlightenment societies like the Freemasons and the Illuminati. A secret agent for one emperor, and a revolutionary plotter against the next. Ignacy Martinovic was a man who lived his life in the shadows. A restless intellect caught in the great ideological storm of his age. But in the end, he would be consumed by that storm, not because of his enemies, but because of a devastating betrayal from the men he called his brothers. The year was 1794. Europe was reeling from the aftershocks of the French Revolution. The monarchies of the Old World, particularly the vast Habsburg Empire ruled from Vienna, were gripped by a paranoid terror of revolutionary ideas. A powerful and efficient secret police force was tasked with hunting down anyone who even whispered the words liberty or republic. In the Hungarian part of the empire, Martinovic, a man who had once served the reformist emperor Leopold II, decided the time was ripe for a revolution against Leopold's reactionary successor, Francis II. He began to build a conspiracy, a Hungarian version of the French Jacobin clubs. He created two secret societies, one for radical Democrats who wanted to overthrow the monarchy completely, and another, more moderate wing for disgruntled nobles who simply wanted more autonomy from Austria. He recruited poets, scholars, former army officers, and intellectuals. Among his most trusted collaborators was a man named Ferenc Yaxkovics, a fiery ex-army captain and a fellow radical. They were comrades in a dangerous game, bound by shared ideals and the secret oaths of their revolutionary brotherhood. They trusted each other with their lives. But the eyes of the Habsburg secret police were everywhere. They soon got wind of the conspiracy, and in July of 1794, while in Vienna, Ignacy Martinovic was arrested. Faced with the certainty of torture and execution, the brilliant intellectual tried to play one last, desperate game. He confessed, but he did so as a double agent, agreeing to become an informant for the police. He began to name his co-conspirators, believing he could control the flow of information, giving up just enough to save his own skin while protecting the core of his movement. It was a dangerous gamble and a betrayal in itself. But he had no idea that back in Hungary, his most trusted friend was about to commit a betrayal far more total and devastating. The police, armed with the information from Martinovic, began to round up the other conspirators. They arrested Ferenc Laxkovics. Laxkovics was now in the same position Martinovic had been in, but he chose a different path. He was not a subtle intellectual accustomed to games of intrigue. He was a soldier who saw a hopeless situation and made a cold, pragmatic calculation for his own survival. To save himself, he decided to give the police everything. He became the state's star witness. He did not just confess his own role, he laid bare the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail. He handed over the complete membership lists for both secret societies. He deciphered their coded letters, revealed their secret meeting places, and explained the full scope of their revolutionary plans. He systematically dismantled the entire movement he had sworn an oath to protect. It was an act of absolute, comprehensive betrayal. The lie was not just that he was a revolutionary. The lie was that his ideals were stronger than his fear. The consequences of Laxkovics' confession were catastrophic. Armed with his complete blueprint of the conspiracy, the police launched a massive crackdown, arresting dozens of the most prominent intellectuals and thinkers in Hungary. A great show trial was convened. Martinovic, Laxkovics, and 5 other leaders of the movement were charged with high treason. The verdict was never in doubt. On May 20th, 1795, the leaders of the Hungarian Jacobin conspiracy were led to a field in the city of Buda. The place would forever after be known as Vamizo, the field of blood. One by one, they were brought to the guillotine and publicly beheaded. The man Laxkovics had so thoroughly betrayed, Ignacy Martinovic was among the first to die. And what of the great betrayer, Ferenc Laxkovics? Did his backstab save him? In the end, it gained him nothing. The Habsburg state, having used him to utterly annihilate the conspiracy, now saw him as just another traitor. His testimony had been useful, but he was still guilty. He was executed on the same day, on the same scaffold, as the very men he had condemned. His betrayal bought him only a few more weeks of life, and an eternity of infamy. From the frenzied mobs of the Hague to the sacred halls of Canterbury Cathedral, from the frozen palaces of Russia to the sun-drenched squares of the Inca Empire, from the Senate floor in Rome to a dark dungeon in medieval England, we have journeyed through history's most brutal and intimate betrayals. We have seen friendships destroyed by power, loyalties erased by greed, and ideologies shattered by fear. Each story is a testament to a chilling truth, that the most dangerous enemy is often the one who smiles to your face, the one you call brother, friend, or ally. They prove that sometimes the entire world you trust can be a lie, built to conceal the dagger waiting in the dark. But which of these backstabs was the most shocking to you? And what do you believe is the ultimate poison that drives someone to betray those they trust most? Is it ambition, greed, fear, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the heart of treachery compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more explorations into the darkest chapters of history.